So for starters, for some quick background information on Rene Descartes, he was a Frenchman. He lived in a time of heady intellectual exploration. His dates are 1596 to 1650. And this was a time when there was substantial revision going on in people's views of the natural world, of the sciences, of the opinions that they had received from the ancients. And Rene Descartes was at the forefront of this. Okay, and in fact, he's not primarily a philosopher. He's primarily a scientist and a mathematician. He was one of the pioneers of algebraic study and actually developed for us the Cartesian coordinate system, which you've used in your high school algebra classes. The idea of visually graphing and representing algebraic equations using a coordinate system is something that can be attributed to Descartes. Okay, he was a biologist. He investigated a variety of different species and learned new things about them. But he is most famous in philosophy for his contributions to the subject of epistemology. Okay, epistemology is, as I've mentioned before in class, a field devoted to the study of knowledge. It asks questions like, what can we know? What are the limits of our knowledge? What is the scope of our knowledge? How confident can we be in our knowledge? What can we rely upon as true knowledge, etc. Again, Descartes is known as the father of modern epistemology because, as we'll see in today's class, he actually approaches the subject of knowledge from a very different perspective than the ancients. And by that I mean Aristotle and Plato, but also very different from Augustine and Aquinas as well. Descartes was schooled in medieval philosophy. He was schooled in his Aquinas and knew his Aristotle well. But actually he is famous in the canon and has become, a world famous thinker over the centuries, precisely because of his rebellion against Aristotelian philosophy. Okay, and when you read Descartes in the Meditations, it's deceptively easy. There's this folksy book. He's sitting by the fire, contemplating his piece of beeswax. He asks you to journey with him on a multi-day journey intellectually as he thinks through his thoughts and surveys his opinions to try to ascertain which opinions are correct and which are not, right? It feels very folksy, but it's deceptively easy because it actually masks some deep, rebellious ideas that Descartes is developing, which were considered at the time to be incredibly radical and which many at the time thought were very dangerous to pursue. Again, we'll see precisely why people thought that in the course of our study today. Okay, let me see if there's anything else in terms of background that you should know about Descartes. I think that's probably sufficient for now. I said a few more things on Thursday. I commend the video on Thursday to you. Take a look at that to find a few more background biographical ideas about Descartes. Let me talk about the Meditations. Okay, the Meditations is a short, punchy, 6-part text. And in each meditation, Descartes, he launches on a different kind of an inquiry, a different kind of a reflection for that particular day of the week. And he starts with a very interesting, famous reflection. Okay, and I'll just introduce it to you guys right here by asking you a simple question. How do you know that you're not dreaming right now? How do you know that you're not dreaming right now? Because sometimes when I have dreams, they sure seem real. And when I'm in them, I think that what's happening in them is really going on. And then I wake up and I realize it was all a dream. So is there some sort of a test that you can use or something you can appeal to to know that you're not dreaming right now. Pinch yourself? I can do that in dreams. Consequences? How so?
Like if you like do something wrong, like steal a candy bar, run out of the store, see if you get arrested, see if it's really happening.
That's a great idea, but I mean, that happens in dreams too, doesn't it? It's the dream of like running away from law enforcement and like not being able to that a lot of people repeatedly have. Right? One dream I repeatedly have is sometimes I'll try to run away from various things, but like I can't, and my legs are like tangled up, and then I fall over in the dream, and I wake up and like my legs are tangled up, but under the blanket, and I can't move them. Right? So sometimes dreams seem very, very real. There's actually a movie made about this a few years ago called Inception. Has anybody seen Inception? So you've seen it? Okay. What's Inception about, guys?
It's about planting ideas inside people's heads through dreams.
Yeah. It's a Leo DiCaprio film. It's actually based exactly on, is inspired by and based on Descartes' meditations. Okay, and the idea is that dreams can sometimes be very real. And the people in the movie Inception, they're able to sort out when they are asleep and when they're awake by virtue of these totems that they use. One person has a chess piece, another person has a top, things like that. Okay, but we don't have that with us, and that's just fiction. Descartes' explanation, yeah, Zaire.
In the movie Inception, they said in a dream you can't remember how you got where you were.
Yeah, they do say that, don't they?
So you can just think about how you got here.
Yeah. Dreams seem to have less of a background than our perspectives right now in real life. I'm sure I'm not dreaming this up right now. But the problem is when I'm in a dream, I actually sometimes am sure I'm not dreaming that up either. Okay, Descartes is famous in the canon not for the conclusions he reaches, but for the method that he takes. Okay, and this method is one of methodological doubt, systematic doubt, radical doubt. Descartes says, he's kind of having this midlife crisis as he writes the meditations. He says, as I think about the opinions that I hold, it becomes clear to me that I have not always held these opinions. Sometimes I've held precisely the opposite opinions in my life. And how am I to know that at some point in the future I will not hold different opinions than what I hold right now? For this reason, he says, I'm going to sift my opinions, sift my knowledge, and try to ascertain what knowledge can be trusted and what knowledge cannot be trusted. Okay, and so he starts inspecting the knowledge that he has. Okay, and he starts doubting the knowledge that he has when he finds it to be lacking in certainty. For instance, human beings know of only a very small percentage of what we know about the world is derived from our direct personal experiences. The great majority of what we know about the world as human beings is derived from the opinions of others. Okay, but the opinions of others are often wrong. For instance, the vast majority of what I know about geography is derived from the opinions of others. I am told that in Florida, in South Florida, there is a city called Miami. I have never been to Miami, but others have told me that Miami exists. A number of people have spoken to me about Miami in the course of my life. And yet I have never personally experienced it. Now, I believe it exists because I am credulous and trust the opinions of others, but I am wholly dependent upon the testimonial knowledge of others in holding this belief to be true. It is not derived from my personal experiences. Here's another example of testimonial knowledge that is a dependent form of knowledge. I believe George Washington was the first president of the United States. I never saw George Washington. No one in this room or anyone alive today ever saw George Washington, and yet I read about it in books, testimonial knowledge. And the authors of these books tell us that George Washington was the first president of the United States. And yet, we know how often people lie. And when historians look at historical documents, they tell me that people back then lied just as much as people do today. And often they actually cannot trust the historical documents that they're sourcing because people lie for the sake of posterity. So maybe people were lying about George Washington being president of the United States. Probably not, because so many people attest to that fact. It's not just a few, it's a large number of people. And yet it is a fact that is entirely based upon testimonial knowledge that is derived from others, and others often are untrustworthy. Now, Descartes' standard of proof is very high in the first meditation. If a particular source of knowledge has proved itself to be untrustworthy in the past, then he's going to discard it or to doubt it, to assume that it's not trustworthy, precisely because it has failed in the past. And he does so because he wants to find something in knowledge, some knowledge fact or some thing that he can know for certain, know for sure. It isn't just going to change like shifting sands, and that he won't discard at some later point in his life when he moves on to some different opinion set. I've talked about the opinions of others and testimonial knowledge, but Descartes is mainly concerned with sensorial knowledge, knowledge derived from our own immediate sensory experiences. And our senses often fail us. So you're driving on the road, on the highway. Maybe it's some deserted place out in West Texas. You don't see anything for miles, but up ahead you see a lake. You get closer, you drive closer. And there's no lake there, it was just a mirage. The sun was playing tricks on your eyes. Your senses have deceived you. Okay, or maybe you're walking out there on Holcomb Mall, right, and you see someone coming towards you, and he looks very tall. You get closer, and it was actually his build that fooled you into thinking he was tall. He's actually slender of build, but he's short. And your senses deceived you. Descartes says, once our senses deceive us, which they frequently do, why should we trust them? Since they've proved themselves to be untrustworthy sources of knowledge in the past, why should we just assume, as most people just naturally, non-reflectively do, that they can be trusted and that they provide us with knowledge that is certain or foundational? Descartes even goes so far as to imagine that a cosmic demon is deceiving him. Okay, this guy's got problems. He takes his method of radical doubt very far. He even imagines that a cosmic demon is deceiving him about the nature of the world. Maybe the world doesn't actually exist the way his senses tell him that it does. Maybe a cosmic demon is actually making him think that the world is a particular way, but in fact, it's not that way at all. Maybe it's all a dream. Maybe he's just dreaming. Okay, Descartes is very clearly in a bind philosophically. Let me illustrate what he's doing here in the first meditation. And that, I think, will make it a little bit clearer for all of us precisely where he's going and why. So here's my best Descartes. He has a kind of a youth pastor goatee in all the pictures. All right, so there's Descartes. And then here are things in the real world. Cars, trees, houses, people, dogs. Okay. All right, you get the point. Okay. Okay, and Descartes in the first meditation makes the point that all of these things get to his mind through his senses, okay, or through testimonial knowledge. And so he perceives them with his eyes, or smells them with his nose, or feels them with his hands or feet. And this is all sensorial input. But his senses often deceive him. So how can he know that these sensorially received objects are indeed what they appear to be? What he does is he says in Meditation 1, I'm going to assume that they're not. I'm going to, we'll call it a doubt curtain. I'm going to assume for myself that my senses are not telling me the truth about these things. So he brackets the truth of the world around him and the objects in the world. And the rest of the meditations will be spent in a project attempting to retrieve those objects again. Attempting to find a way to trust his senses, to trust the testimony of others, to believe once more that the world is the way that it appeared to him to be. Okay, but let me say a couple of things about the method here and why the method is important. Descartes has gone down in the canon as a really famous and influential philosopher precisely because of this method of doubt, of systematic doubt. If you look at the thought of the ancients or the medievals, they start with the assumption that their senses function successfully, that the testimony of others is trustworthy, and that the world is as it appears to be. In other words, that what their senses are telling them about the world is more or less a correct or accurate representation of the world. But Descartes doesn't start with that at all. Descartes instead starts by assuming that the world is not as it appears to be. And this has gone down in history as a very famous turn in philosophy. He's the first modern philosopher because he starts with doubt rather than belief. And because Descartes and his idea that maybe things aren't as they appear to be this is a nugget of thought that has been incredibly important in the development of modern scientific inquiry. Okay, and in fact, if you look at the scientific breakthroughs that have been made over the last several hundred years since Descartes, what immediately becomes apparent is that a lot of these breakthroughs were made by people who assumed, as a starting point of their inquiries, that the explanation for this phenomenon they were trying to investigate is not the obvious explanation. There must be some other, deeper, non-visible, non-discernible explanation. In other words, the world is not as it appears to be, and the deep explanations of the world, the deep scientific principles that govern our world, are not the things that we can immediately discern with our senses. So it is precisely by rejecting what they perceive the world to be that later thinkers have made scientific breakthroughs. In fact, when we operate at a microparticle level, it turns out the world is very, very different than it appears at a macro level. This table in front of me appears to be a very stable object. But when you drill down to microparticles, the quantum level and all that, the quantum physicists tell us that microparticles are incredibly unstable, and that you actually can't know with certainty where any particular electron is at any particular time. All they can know is with general probabilities, because by virtue of the observation process, you actually alter the trajectory of the electron. Okay, but you don't have to know all that to know. The main point is just this. Descartes' idea that the true explanation for the world must be something different than the way the world appears has been a really important idea. It's been an idea that has spread throughout the scientific method and has shaped many different forms of inquiry over the years. Let me pause and ask for questions or comments so far. Any reflections so far on any of this? Zaire.
So you said if your senses, or that's what he said. If your senses lead you, how can you trust them?
That's what he says, yes.
But
I think he's got a lot of problems, by the way.
like if your senses do lead you like in the right direction, can you trust them?
Yeah, so here's why I trust my senses. By the way, which sense do people trust the most? When the senses are in conflict with each other, which one do they trust the most?
Sight.
That is correct. People trust their sight. Even though actually, they think naturally sight is the strongest of the senses, right? But actually it often deceives us much more than other senses. And when senses are in conflict, we almost always choose sight over other senses, even though studies have shown that other senses are often more reliable. But what was that?
I was gonna ask which one's like the most reliable.
Oh, most reliable? I don't know. I'm not sure about that. I was just reading an article about how people apparently believe sight much more than they should. The reason why I trust my senses, speaking personally, is because I guess they're right most of the time. But actually, I was talking with Professor Hinsey not too long ago. He's a legal studies professor, teaches legal environmental business for us. And he said in the courtroom, the most untrustworthy form of knowledge is actually testimonial knowledge. So the witness's testimony is generally considered to be the most untrustworthy form of knowledge. Sometimes it's because the witnesses are intentionally deceiving. So there's that. But actually, often, it's just because people just misperceive situations. And they thought something went down in a particular situation, but they're relying upon memory, and it actually wasn't that way at all. And maybe their minds have filled in the details, the gaps that were missing in the situation, and it's actually an unreliable witness that they have become in the courtroom. Okay, I guess I would say I trust my senses most of the time because, in fact, almost all the time, because they generally are reliable. It's rare that, it is a mirage or I do misjudge something. Descartes takes it further, though, and he says, if my senses have failed me, I'm going to reject them as forms of knowledge, as sources of knowledge, for the pursuit of something that I can actually rely upon or believe in with certainty. Does that help a little bit, Zaire? Is your question? Cool. Good. Other questions or comments? Here's how I know I'm not dreaming right now. The level of clarity that I have in my sensory perceptions right now is vastly greater than it is when I'm dreaming. Yeah, it's just like the level of detail and the granularity of your experiences when you're awake are immensely superior to that when you're dreaming. I sure hope it's not. All right, let's talk about meditation 2. I will read you guys some bits from the meditations, but I'm going to do that shortly after the break. Let's talk about meditation 2. and I'll begin to talk about the trajectory of the overall meditations as a work. Okay, all right, well, let me ask you guys. So if you can't trust knowledge derived from the testimony of others, and you can't trust knowledge derived from your senses, what can you know for certain? That's why we're here. That's one response. Okay, and in fact, speaking personally, I can't think a thought that doesn't originally come from my senses. Right? If I try to think of anything in my mind, ultimately what I'm thinking of can be derived from my senses. Even if I think of imaginary objects. Suppose I'm imagining a unicorn, right? I'm imagining a winged horse, or that's Pegasus, right? But a horse with like a horn, that can be derived ultimately from my experiences of horses and pictures of horses, and also animals with horns and pictures of animals with horns. So that's sensorially traceable. What if we bracketed all sensorial knowledge? You can't trust anything that comes from your senses, so you can't take that as certain knowledge. You can't trust anything anybody else has told you. What's left? Is there anything else that's certain?
I don't think it's possible to not trust your senses or other people's testimony, like at all, like nothing.
I'm with you. I'm totally there. Like, I think this guy has a lot of problems.
I think it's possible. Somebody could just tell you, hey, everything you know is a lie.
Right.
I would.
Sure, yeah. Isn't that what happens to Neo in The Matrix? Yeah. He like wakes up one day and finds out it's all a lie. What Descartes thinks he can know for certain when he brackets all knowledge derived from his senses from other sources, what he thinks he can still know for certain is his own existence. Okay, he knows he exists. This is a piece of knowledge that he thinks is certain. It's true. This is a famous Latin formula. There is a famous Latin formula for it. Cogito ergo sum is the Latin here. Descartes never says this directly, but he says many things to this effect. Literally, this is translated as, I think, therefore I am. The reason why he knows for certain that he exists is because he can think. He's a thinking thing. He can use his mind to think about his existence. And as long as he can think about whether he exists or not, he knows that he does exist, and has proved his existence by virtue of the fact that he is thinking about his existence. Yes? A little louder, you're talking through a mask.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's cool.
If I had to guess, he probably would think he didn't have a soul, he just a mind.
Great question. So Descartes is actually a good Catholic. And we're going to find out that he actually subscribes to all the basic doctrines of the Catholic Church. He arrives at them from a very different perspective. Okay, so he does ultimately, and at the end of the meditations, think that he has a soul. However, for the purposes of this exercise, he's starting with nothing. And he's trying to say, well, what still remains if all the knowledge that I have received from the past, all the knowledge about, people telling me I've got a soul, people telling me that the world exists, people telling me that there are other people around me, creatures, humans just like me, all of this knowledge. What if I just assumed this was all false? What would remain? And although he will ultimately say he's got a soul, for now all that he's saying in the second meditation is, my own existence is what remains. I exist. Okay, the famous Latin formula is just, I think, therefore I am. The fact that he's a thinking thing demonstrates his existence. Now, when I first encountered this some years ago, when I was in college and sat in a philosophy class, I thought to myself, duh! Of course you exist. That's self-evident. Okay, but remember, Descartes is in the canon because of his method, not necessarily because of the results that he achieves. And this idea of starting with an anthropocentric foundation, a human-centered foundation for his philosophy is really important, and it's singularly identifiable as a characteristic of modern philosophy. Okay, so whereas the start of the thinking of someone like Augustine or Aquinas would have been with God's existence, and on the basis of God's existence, they then derive other things about the world, Descartes starts with his own existence, a human-centered, anthropocentric fact. And on that basis, he then goes on to build philosophically into other kinds of conclusions. Okay, that's a really important turn in thought. The idea that humans should start with humans first and assume that the rest of the things that we have received from the tradition are all false. It's a really important, that rebellious nugget is a really important turn of thought that's very influential in the early modern and modern eras in philosophy and in science. Okay, questions or comments about the cogito? This is probably the most famous part of the meditations, the cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Questions or comments about that? So Descartes has started the meditations by assuming that his opinions about all of these things in the world, trees, cars, houses, people, dogs, are all false because they've been derived from his senses. He started with this curtain of doubt, as I'm calling it, that now separates him from the things in the world. In the course of the rest of the meditations, he's going to try to retrieve this knowledge that he has bracketed, as it were, and assumed to be false. He's going to try to find a way to believe it to be true again. Okay, he's going to try to find some path philosophically to once again trust his senses and believe that the cars that he thought existed and were a particular way, right? Not in his era, of course, but, horses or whatever at that time. Trees, houses, people, and dogs. He's going to try to find a way to believe that what his senses tell him about these things are trustworthy. What these deliverances of his senses are trustworthy. How do you guys think he's going to do that? Any speculation? Using his senses, but he can't use his senses, can he? Okay. Okay. Good. That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to regain trust in his senses. He's starting with the fact of his own existence. That's his starting point. And now he's got to regain trust in his senses. But he can't use knowledge derived from his senses. So he's got to come up with some knowledge based on his own existence that then enables him to trust his senses. Does he know he's a body? He knows he exists. But what does he know about his existence? That he can think. That he's a thinking thing. Does he know he's got a body? No, right? Because his knowledge of the fact that he has a body comes from his senses. Okay, I have had... Yeah, he thinks he's just a thinking thing, a soul. I have had 3 kids now. I'm about to have my 4th kid in May. My wife is 7 months preggers. She will give birth May 26th is her due date, right after the semester. Okay, it's wild at our house right now. My older kids are 5, 3, and 1. And you know what I've learned? Little kids don't come out knowing much about themselves at all. They have to discover their toes. They kind of don't know they have them. In fact, they don't know they have them. They don't know they have legs. They don't know they have arms until they discover them. And like there's this moment in like the life of about a 2-month-old or so, a little bit less, 1.5 months, where they're kind of like looking down at their toes and they realize, whoa, when I think a thought, this thing moves. It's like, cool. But that's discovered by our senses, right? So Descartes can't trust that yet. He can't know that he's got a body because that's sensorially perceived. So here's how he does it. Descartes will endeavor in the course of the meditations to prove God's existence. And if God exists and is a truth teller, which Descartes thinks he can prove, then God will guarantee the deliverances of his senses, because God as a truth teller would not present a world to him that would be manifestly false and unlike what his senses perceive it to be. Okay, so once more, Descartes in the course of the meditations will attempt to prove God's existence, and then God will serve as a guarantee that the world exists and that his senses can be trusted and that the objects around him are more or less as he perceives them to be, because God will be a truth teller and would not lie to him and would not present a world to him that could not be trusted. Yes?
So what would happen if he saw something and his senses was wrong? Would you think like God is not real, or
Great question.
would he say like, well, it's just me?
Yeah. So actually that's what Meditation 4 is devoted to, and we will get there. Just a quick preview of what it's about. If God's a truth teller and won't lie to him, then Descartes' got to come up with an explanation for why his senses make errors, why he makes mistakes. And ultimately, he will say that he makes mistakes because he makes decisions in the absence of knowledge. If and when he has full knowledge, he thinks that he doesn't make mistakes in those situations. I think he's wrong, actually, and I'll tell you guys why. I'll tell you now. There have been many times in my life where I have had full knowledge and I have still made a wrong decision. So I actually don't buy a solution in Meditation 4, but he thinks that the answer is that he makes mistakes with his senses because he makes decisions about something before he has full knowledge. And that would certainly explain the mirage on the road or the person you thought was tall in Holcomb Mall. Full knowledge enables you to make a correct judgment in those cases. But I ultimately disagree with him on that topic because there have been lots of situations where I personally have had full knowledge and still have made the wrong decision. Like, I have stood in front of the vending machine at 4:30 p.m. after a long day of work, looking at the famous Amos cookies, knowing full well that if I press the button and eat those cookies, they will shorten my lifespan. They will fatten me up. My wife will find me less attractive. My time spent with my grandchildren will be diminished. My life's successes, my flourishing will be reduced by virtue of that decision. And yet, I push that button anyway. Well, I chose like momentary pleasure over long-term, the immediate, smaller, sooner reward over the larger, later reward of time spent with my grandchildren. Yeah.
But what about if you did the exact opposite and you still ended up with the same results?
Yeah, well, I agree with that. I don't think you could ever have full knowledge, right?
That's the truth. You didn't really have full knowledge, because if you could have not ate those cookies and gone outside and got hit by a bus, and then your life over.
True. Again, I agree. I think it's never possible to have full knowledge, right? My wife and I, in good faith, have had several children. right? We think that having children is a good thing for the world. Okay? Honestly, we think if we raise our daughters right, then our daughters will be contributors to the world and will help make the world a better place. It's good for like the good parents to have kids, right? That's a good thing. So the bad parents don't have all the kids. But I mean, we don't know. Maybe my 5-year-old will grow up to be the next, I don't know, female Hitler. Like, we don't know. Like, do you really think Hitler's parents had him? Like, knowing, like, we're going to make a mass murderer out of this kid. Like, no, everybody has good intentions, but we don't have full knowledge. We don't know what actually is going to happen in the future. Well, I don't think it is either. That's why I disagree with him. Actually, I don't think I answered your question. Could you state it again? Cool. That's cool.
No. I said, what about if, like you said, like you can have all the facts or the knowledge or whatever, and still end up making the wrong decision. And then you said something about like, well, you ate cookies because knowing this can shorten my life. But I'm like, what about if you was like a full blown vegan, work out every day, you still like end up with cancer and die?
Right. Yeah, well, certainly bad things can happen to us in life, even when we do make the right decisions. Yeah, without a doubt. But I think what the point I'm making over and against Descartes is, in Meditation 4, as we'll find out, he argues that the reason why he makes mistakes is because he makes decisions without full knowledge. And the point I'm making is just you can have full knowledge and still make mistakes. Or at least I have known many of the reasons why I shouldn't have Famous Amos cookies, and yet I still make mistakes. But like Zaire says, I mean, maybe if I hadn't selected the Famous Amos cookies the other day, that would have speeded up my trajectory by 10 seconds, and I would have gotten hit by a bus. So, I mean, maybe it was a good thing that I selected them. Who knows? Saved my life right there. Could have happened. Okay. I believed myself to be making a bad decision, and yet I was making a good one. Okay, let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, and I'm going to say some things. We're going to do, most of Descartes will be discussion of philosophy of science. So we're going to do a lot of discussion of scientific method and the background assumptions that inform that.